Welcome back to another episode of Speaking Tongues. I'm here today with Emily. Emily runs the YouTube channel Language Travel Adoptee, where she shares how to boost confidence in your languages. She advocates that analyzing our life story behind the languages we speak is the most powerful tool for success. And I agree with that. Emily, how are you? Thank you for joining me today.
It is such an honor to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Great, doing wonderful. I'm so excited to talk to you and to have this conversation with you. I like to start each episode with the same question, and that is, what is your first language and which languages have you learned to speak?
That is already a really interesting question off the bat because if you had asked me that even 3 years ago, I would have said my first language is English because it's my native language. But after hearing different stories from other people and thinking back, I'm like, well, really, technically, my first language is Chinese. I mean, that's what that's what I came home speaking. I was only speaking English up until probably 18, right before I went to college. And that's when I started studying German, kind of fell in love with it. And then it all snowballed into Italian. We had some Spanish. I went to Germany, and that's when I saw a lot of other exposure to Turkish and Arabic, a little bit of Russian. And especially when I came back during the pandemic, I was like, I'm going all in with languages. So I really ramped it up and also ramped up the reflection too, now that I could just stop and have some time to myself. And out of that came Chinese. So yeah.
Amazing. What were the things that led you to those languages when you turned 18 and you went off to college, especially falling in love with German? I feel like is not a sentiment I hear very often. So what were the things, and that's just me, no shade to German or
Oh, I've
German
heard it too.
speakers, but but what were some of the things that drew you to the languages that you learned to speak?
Yeah, another great question. And well, I think at that age when you are finally allowed to have a little bit more freedom to really know who you are, you've just gotten out of high school, and it was kind of a time where I felt like I wanted to run away from all of my problems that I was having at that age, mental health wise. I had gone through a really tough physical injury because I was also dancing pre-professionally, really wanting to build up that side of my career. But my injury was obviously an injury, but there was also probably 80% of mental mental drawbacks that I got from that physical injury. So I really wanted something that was distracting me. And so German, I knew that I wanted to study abroad, and I knew that there were a lot of American expats in Germany. Those were
Mm,
the only two things I needed to know to kind of convince me, all right, well, I know I want to go abroad by myself and have that freedom, and why not start it now? Because there's so many resources online. I have nothing else better to do, and I'm really sad. So German really helped me through that. So that definitely strengthens the emotional connection first and foremost. And it's really been, I'm trying to think, I mean, I have so many different reasons for going to certain languages. Um, Italian, I studied right after German. I studied them both at the same time just because Italian was also a language that I wanted to use to go to a study abroad program, but specifically for dance. So that was totally unexpected. I was expecting to go to Germany first, but I actually went to Italy and then I went to Germany. And then once I got to Germany, and it was something, totally unexpected, was that there was a lot of perceptions from other people that due to my being adopted, right? Me growing up in a culture that was all full of white people, I considered myself white in a lot of just unconscious ways, or I guess subconscious ways, and not really reflecting about that because I didn't really want to at the time. I wasn't ready emotionally to process that. But I went to Germany just thinking, I'm going to be treated like every other American. Hi, I'm American. And so many people just did not believe me at all.
mm,
Or they thought I was playing around with them, that kind of thing. And so that went on for yeah, I mean, 1.5 years the whole time that I was abroad. And that was my very first experience having that independence and really starting to think a little bit more for myself. I guess starting to be a little bit more brave about thinking for myself because I always had ideas, but languages and language learning really opened me up to my own autonomy in that way. And in a way, of course, the pandemic was horrible for a lot of people, but I am grateful for that time to really reflect on what I had been through and how I
Mm.
want to show up with languages. And I knew, learning Turkish, for example, when I started to feel like I wasn't belonging in Germany, when I started to get those kind of comments, I thought, well, there are a lot of Turkish Germans, and I was taking a class about like German Turkish literature. I'm not exactly sure of the exact name, but it was essentially telling me that they also, even though they weren't adopted, right? But they still had a strong sense of, oh, well, I'm not sure if these people think that I belong here in Germany. I'm not sure if they actually think I'm German because I look Turkish. I might have a Turkish accent whenever I speak German. So they had that dichotomy there. And I was like, well, this is the group that I am going to attach myself onto the most as a coping mechanism because I don't feel like I belong in the German language, even though, German is still my all-time favorite language, and I think it'll always be like that. But that's why I started learning Turkish, essentially.
Mhm.
It really helped me feel belonging
Right.
in Germany, and I've never stopped learning it. I try to do some passive things with it nowadays, but I was definitely very much into Turkish when I was in Germany. And again, a little bit with Arabic, again, just knowing that, okay, there is different media that is always going to be biased against people who speak these target languages. And I want
Right.
to, yeah, it's so sad. And I want to get behind that because, I think once you appreciate, well, I guess first bring your awareness to more layers of who you are. After
Hmm.
you give that to yourself, it's so much easier to want to give it to other people and see that in other people and want to discover more of their layers. So, yeah, so that again, that kind of snowballed into Russian and Arabic there. And then again, it all kind of led up to wanting to learn Mandarin this year, um, and be kind of loud about it because I mean, before that, I was like, I'm so ashamed. Like, I talk a lot about a lot of the emotions that you have behind language learning, and especially with the identity aspect too, which is why I love your podcast as well, because there's so many different stories around that topic. So essentially there are a ton of reasons why I chose different languages, but they all fit together very nicely in the end now that I look back on it.
Yeah, yeah. Talking about identity, and I think it's really, what you said, and I caught on to is just being ethnically Chinese and you're going to Germany and people not believing that you don't speak Mandarin. It really brings up such a question of that shouldn't even be asked, but like who's allowed to speak certain languages? Who is allowed to have access to certain spaces and certain languages? And I guess I feel like the conversation we have here in the United States, everything is built on race in this country. But in other parts of the world, and particularly Europe, that's not something that is an easy train of thought for a lot of Europeans to grasp and to really understand, at least has been in my experience and from what I've seen of other people. I think I don't really have like a question on this. It's just like something that I'm thinking as you say it out loud and talk about the experience that you had with that. And it's a profound experience to have, I think. The other thing that you mentioned and I wrote down and noted is talking about Arabic. And it's funny because um, I had that same thought post 9/11 when I was in college and how, I was studying journalism and I had a teacher who said, go listen to or go read Al Jazeera and go read um, news from other parts of the world because this this is a language and this is a culture that's being villainized by a certain lens, and you don't want to get just the one story from that. So I love that you said that, just being aware of how the perception can be of a language, and you took that step to want to learn the language because you noticed that you were aware of that bias that people had. So I think that's really, really powerful. I know that you're very vocal about your adoption story, and you're very vocal about your background, and I'd love for you to tell us, our listeners, a little bit about your story and your background.
I was adopted around 16 months from southern China, and I don't have obviously any memory of China at all. I didn't have any memory of even speaking Chinese when I came home, even though my mom told me I was saying some words in Chinese already. And I was adopted by a single mom, so we're quite a small family. But of course, we have a lot of animals, and we stayed in the same place the whole time. So I was raised in Arkansas, of course, in the Bible Belt, but we were in a very, I would say, liberal bubble within the Bible Belt. And that was something that my mom she had moved around so much. I mean, every 2 years when she was smaller, and she knew how shy I was. So I'm glad that we stayed in exactly one place.
Mm,
And of course, I had spoken a little bit about this beforehand, but of course, it's all in retrospect when you look back and you're like, wow, I was really affected by that, right? And so, of course, I was almost exclusively surrounded by white people. I mean, it's all in my family. No one else was adopted transnationally, just in between two countries. No one really spoke about it. No one made me feel different, which in hindsight, I overall am really glad about that. I know some adoptees will not be, but just from how I interpreted it, I was glad that I never felt othered, because that can really put a downer on your spirit, of course,
yeah.
um, especially from your own family. So I'm glad I never had any of that. I was always treated the same. And of course, there were some microaggressions, inevitably, but overall, I would say I never really felt the weight of those microaggressions, and I didn't have very many targeted at me up until I went to Europe. Um, but of course, all that to say is it was just like a slap in the face basically when I went to Europe, because I was just not used to people looking at me and like talking at me in that way. And I had never wanted to process my adoption. I had never wanted to go back to revisit China. I don't really use go back to your roots thing. There was something that Germans always said was like, Wurzeln for roots. They always loved using that word, particularly when they were talking to me and trying to just dictate what I did in terms of my identity and stuff. And yeah, but I don't use that. I don't think I use it even now, because how I interpret it and how I know I connect with it, it's just a lost piece of the past it's still tied to me now, but it doesn't make me Chinese. Like I know I don't belong in China. Of course, I'm only speaking from my experience, but I know I don't belong there. I've always felt big belonging in the US. And I think as we were talking about sort of the differences between what I experienced in both, the United States and Western Europe and those countries, but also when I traveled outside of Europe too. I mean, even in parts of like Northern Africa, um, and Eastern Europe too, it seemed like there was a lack of acceptance that someone can identify more with their cultural identity instead of their ethnic identity. And so many people just did not understand why I did not identify at all with my ethnic identity. And of course, adoption it can go really deep, and that's not something that I always wanted to talk about right when I first met someone. So
I wanted to have this conversation with you because I want to have more conversations about identity, and I want to have more conversations about where we feel comfortable where we fit in and where we feel that we belong. And sometimes those things don't align with our skin color or our place of birth or even our family members. And I think what's so unfortunate is that we're so often made to feel like that's not natural or that's not okay. And, you know, you're saying you had people trying to dictate how you should identify, and that's that's not okay. I'm just thinking about identity and language, and I love that you've been able to bring the two together and find a common connection between the two, because I don't feel like very often people who study languages take into account that the language that they study and the language that's in their textbook is a language that people use daily all over the world, and people from different ethnicities and different backgrounds and social status and everything in between, skin colors, use the language as a form of communication. And I don't say that to be dismissive of people who are learning. It's just that oftentimes I feel like it's very easy for learners to take the language for what it is and leave everything else on the side. And I don't want to contribute to that conversation, which is why I like having a conversation such as this with you, where we're talking about more of the deeper issues and nuances that come with learning a language and identifying with a community and feeling at home or at place within a community. And I'm saying that to say that I'm glad that you're doing that work. I'm glad that you're putting your story out there and that you are being a place, a safe space for people who want to explore these, this part in the periphery maybe of language learning. So thank you for doing that, and thank you for doing that work and for having that conversation. I think it's very, very important to have.
Yes, thank you so much. That's always reassuring to hear because again, like you said, I don't really see a lot of people doing it. I see a lot more podcasts these days talking a little bit more about it, but especially in the space that I have always loved to run in as a language learner. I mean, YouTube was always like at the top of my list. It still is my chosen platform, and it's my chosen platform as a creator. So, there's definitely a lack of discourse around it. Um, but again, I know that I think it takes a lot of just constant exploring, and I really want to be the person that helps others, even if they might not identify all with my story. I know, as you said, like there's always a part of us that feels like we do not belong somewhere, or we feel guilty for wanting to belong somewhere else. Within language learning, also outside of it too. So if I can really help others just after they listen to something, and introduce them to podcasts like yours or any other content that I find that has that kind of discussion, then really helping them peel back some of their own layers about themselves and go even deeper. I think that's such a beautiful thing. And not only helpful for language learning, but just, I mean, also in life, it really brings a certain peace to it, if you know what
Yeah,
I mean. Yeah.
yeah, it definitely does. Was there a moment that you had that a moment where you decided that this was the story that you wanted to tell? Was there a moment where you decided you wanted to open up about your story and the path that you're on to learning languages and to helping other people with their identity struggles as well?
Definitely. So, of course, during the pandemic, I was actually in Europe. So I got to see how, Asian looking people were treated both in Europe and in the United States. And that just made me, want to go home, obviously. And so I did. And I started to well, I would say before that, I had never been interested in talking with any other adoptees. That was another really important part. I was always just turned off by whenever my mom would try to introduce me to Asian families. Like they
Mm,
culturally and ethnically Chinese most of the time. And I was just like, I don't understand why you're doing this. Just leave me alone. But of course, during such a time, it's in those times where, of course, I think humans need the most community and not have to explain themselves. I think that's healing in its own way. And so I started connecting with other adoptees, either from Korea or from China specifically. And we just started talking and having some support groups, and talking about different experiences within the COVID pandemic with some of the racism that was going on and how we felt.
Of
And it
course.
was really at that point where I was like, okay, like talking with people that look like me, not only look like me, but they've had the exact same experience of being adopted and having all of these different layers of identity, you know, thrown onto them at the same time. They have so many good insights, and that makes me know that I think I also have a story to share. And that was something that I really needed as a language learner when I was just starting out with German. I think that would have really helped me. And so that's why I want to open up my story, in more of a language niche context,
Hmm.
but still share that story because I know that there are so many other people who have built these different emotional relationships with their languages, whether they were raised, bilingual, trilingual, they learned it and whatnot. They couldn't learn it because of their family or whatnot. Um, and I want to start it out just with my story and just being completely open. And especially with thinking about, and really, I think coming into myself in terms of living by some of my values that I think were covered up for a long time. Um, I knew there was a lot of shame around language learning in terms of Chinese, especially, but really any other Asian language. I just did not want to associate myself with them. And I didn't even want to associate with other people who were learning them at that point. I mean, I was just in protective mode all the way. And so I discovered though, and I love what Brene Brown says about it too, but just, shame is going to keep on growing if you hide it, right? And
Love
so
Brene Brown. Love
yeah,
her.
she's awesome. She's amazing. Um, and but that I mean that is so, so true. And I was like, you know what? I'm tired of hiding even, what I'm doing with my YouTube channel as well from my family, from my friends. I mean, no one even knew because I was just ashamed also of the YouTube channel and also ashamed of what I was feeling about my adoption, how I was figuring that out on my own. And so, really knowing, okay, I remember even last Christmas, I had brought it up to my partner, I think I'm going to share my story. I think that's what the language community needs. It was like, oh, that's a good idea. Now, as well, whenever people ask me about it, I don't have to take like an hour explaining it to them. I can just send them that video. So it
Right?
kind of hits two birds with one stone. Yeah.
If you don't mind talking about it, and it's perfectly okay if you don't want to talk about it, but you mentioned that you were in protection mode and you were protecting, you didn't want to speak with people who were learning Asian languages or, particularly Chinese. And you mentioned earlier that you didn't want to meet with the other Asian American families that your mom was trying to introduce you to. What do you think, or do you know, that you were protecting?
I was protecting myself from even thinking about loss and grief, I think, because there's still like so much grief and loss in adoption itself. And I think a lot of adoptees can resonate with me on the fact that we hear so much about the adoptive parents and how they're just so happy to have this new kid in their lives. Um, but there is so much loss, and it'll kind of stay with us for however long we live, right? And so just having that and not even knowing what it was, but just knowing, oh, that feels dangerous. So I'm not going to even touch on it. There's nothing in my life that's going to force me to do it.
Mm.
Um, fast forward a few years and then it definitely appeared in some way because it is a part of my story. And so, um, yeah, there's a lot of that. And I think coping with that loss and that grief, part of that was um, dealing with the shame and coming out with it in a vulnerable way to other people who I knew that would understand. That was very healing in itself. And the fact that I, announced that I was going to learn Chinese as well in that same video, that was also just a way of reclaiming what I felt like I still had control over.
Mm-hmm.
Because, obviously, when you're taken away from your biological family, unfortunate government policies, politics that really deeply interfered with people's lives, more than I think the media has ever really covered it, especially for the families in China that were forced to give up some of their
Right.
family that way. It's such a healing thing, and I think different people can relate to that in that way. Coping with something. I think we all learn languages to cope with something. So it's going to be different, but you know.
Huh. We learn languages to cope with something. You got me thinking. You got me thinking what I could have been coping with the languages that I wanted to learn. Maybe I'll come back to that. I got to give that some thought. So I'm glad you brought that up because I love when someone gives me something to like noodle over because it's something that I never thought of before. If you enjoyed this episode of Speaking Tongues, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the Speaking Tongues podcast on Apple Podcasts and like and subscribe on Spotify and YouTube so that other language lovers like ourselves can find the show. If you've been a longtime listener of the show or even a recent listener, you can now pledge ongoing support for the show on buymeacoffee.com or on patreon.com. Talk to me about, you've you've had experience with German, with Italian, Arabic, multiple other languages. And did you have a moment where you said, I'm ready to embrace Mandarin? I'm ready to take this step? Did it happen organically? Was it just something that came to you overnight? Was it a gradual process? Can you talk to us about how you came to the doorstep of learning Mandarin?
Yeah, it was definitely, I would say, a gradual process in the scheme of things. And then it was like a light switch once I got the idea for sharing my adoption story. Because, I was thinking also just in terms of creating content, which was, okay, how am I going to really embody this for viewers so they can kind of follow me on the journey? And have it to do with language. Okay, well, it totally makes sense to learn Chinese and know that there's going to be a lot of boundary setting that I need to do with myself, but also that I am totally ready for it. And it does not matter if people in the past told me to learn it or, where I should go or whatever. Um, I had really built up that self-trust and really self-belonging in myself in order to take that step and know how to differentiate myself from a lot of those really like negative, like icky feeling emotions, inner critic, all of that, which I know will definitely come up during this process. I mean, I'm still definitely like in this process
Yeah.
as we speak. And it's a little bit more passive right now just because, juggling life and responsibilities. But yeah, I think it's always going to be a gradual process. I think with some languages, it was just automatic, just, oh, I know I'm going to learn this. I'm going to stick with it. I really love the different cultures that are involved with it, etc. But I know with this one already that it's okay to take it slow. You don't have to hustle. You don't have to do anything. Um, you know what's better to do for you and for your mental health. So that's what you're going to do. And if you need to stop, then you can. It doesn't say anything about you. Um, so yeah, overall a gradual process, I think.
Okay.
Mhm.
Now, what was your approach? Did you try approaches that you were familiar with, or did you decide, you know what, new language, new system, new way of doing things? Did you just start from scratch, or did you use any old tricks?
Yeah, and it's interesting with this question because I always advise whenever language learners are having some sort of issue or struggle, like really stepping out of their comfort zone, I'm always a very big advocate of, well, how can you use your comfort zone and expand safely within it. And so the way that I did that was I had previously, back in 2020, used Pimsleur just to, try that whole speaking from day one thing during the pandemic when I didn't have a lot more to do with Russian. And I really liked that method. So honestly, that is all that I've been using for Mandarin Chinese. Before that, and also during, I was like, you know what, I don't think I'm ready to really expand into looking for more resources or how to learn it best with all of those videos on YouTube because I feel like that's going to ignite a little bit more of my perfectionist mode with wanting to, move fast. And I know that that is not, in the end, going to be productive for my soul and for my mental health with
Right.
such a language, with such a relationship to that language. So I mean, I didn't even know that people were going to be offended when you say only Chinese instead of Mandarin Chinese. I still don't know why they're offended, but I know that I've heard that in a lot of videos. So once I heard people talking about it that way, I was like, oops. Um, but I mean that's just how much I'm still, protecting myself in that way of knowing that there's going to be an emotional overload at some point. I don't know when.
Hmm.
Most likely when I start talking to actual like real people, because that's something that I want to do, but I know it's going to take a lot of time to get there. So
Yeah.
Pimsleur is literally the only thing, and I haven't learned anything anything else about it.
So how far into this journey are you right now?
Yeah, so I am on level 4. And that's it. That is all that I have really committed myself to doing this year, just because I knew with all the unpredictable stuff going on in life, that is what I knew was going to be manageable since it's
Hmm.
very easily done just in the car and you don't even have to look at anything.
Right. You started in 2023. What are some things you expected that you've encountered? What are some things that surprised you that you've encountered? And I guess what are some things that you are excited to encounter?
Yeah, such good questions. Let me see which one I want to start with. I think for the things that I expected, definitely, I mean, of course, knowing that there would be emotion with a lot of shame going into it. Especially when I filmed my very first sort of update. And I was actually just recording myself speaking in Mandarin. And once I saw myself, like I was editing the video, and I saw that coming out of my mouth, I was like, oh gosh, I don't know if I want to publish this. Um, Now, it doesn't feel as foreign and alien as it did that very first time,
Hmm.
but I'm still just like, wow, like I'm not sure what I think about that. And also just being certain that there's going to be a lot of uncertainties in the fact of how I choose to approach it next. Again, I'm almost done with Pimsleur. So I don't know where it's going to take me next, but that's okay. And just learning, keeping on reinforcing to myself that it is okay to be uncertain. And there is a lot of good in the uncertainty. And I think what I didn't expect, and I had talked about this on my channel too, was that it's, I think when we are traumatized in a sense, there's a lot of thinking in black and white, again, just to protect ourselves. Like there's no shame in that. There's no fault in that. We're just trying to live our lives in survival mode, right? And so, every single time I saw an Asian person, again, every single time that I knew that someone had to do something with studying an Asian language or studying Asian studies in college, things like that, that always set off just alarm bells in my head. I did not want absolutely anything to do with it. Um, and so, yeah, I was thinking a lot in black and white for most of my life about any other Asian looking person.
Hmm.
And what was really healing to me about all of this too is that really it started this year, but now I can really see how I'm humanizing them and being curious about them and knowing that, in Asia, there are so many different people with different stories and they're not out to hurt you. Um, I don't feel that anymore in my nervous system with wanting to just like flee from any of that. So I think it's a beautiful thing to keep on humanizing such a big part of the world. It's
Hmm.
great. And I think that, I think for all of us, really, just as we live our lives, of course, there's a lot of getting to know ourselves, getting to know, more of our authentic selves on a deeper level. And so I think with all of that, it's like, well, I don't know this is how this is going to lead me or where it's going to lead me to, but I do know that um, I'm finally allowed to be more of my truer self now that I know that I can humanize these people. Um, and that, again, with that sentiment, I'm now very much open to dabbling really in any language. Before that, I mean, for the last 9 years, ever since I started with German, I was like, I'm not going to dabble until well, I'm not even going to dabble, but I'm not going to even start that next language until I'm like advanced speaker in this language. And now it's just like, well, um, I think it's okay to try something new. It's okay. So
Yeah.
a lot of good unexpected things.
Yeah, that's great. That's really wonderful. You have German and you have Italian and you have Russian and you have Arabic. Now, I'm looking at this list, this short list that I just put these four side by side. Um, and they're all different, like language family wise, and their pronunciation wise, and structure wise. With Mandarin being the fifth one that I'm, is not in common with any of those. What are you finding different that stands out? And I mean, obviously, it's different. So there are going to be standout things. But I guess, what are some of the things that so far that you've noticed that are standout, things that you've had to kind of think differently of? I think about this because all of my languages are romance languages, and that's my bad. Like that's my fault, right?
Mm.
And I accept it, and it is what it is. But I tried learning German the beginning of the pandemic, and the beginning of the lockdown, I tried learning German, and the gymnastics that my brain had to do to understand how to say the same thing that I can tell you in French and Italian or Spanish, or pretend to tell you in Portuguese, because I pretend I speak Portuguese and I don't. But it's just the way of thinking had to change for me so much, with basic things. And I gave up. Spoiler alert, I don't speak German. Um, so for you, and I would imagine with the four that you have under your belt right now, you're used to that level of gymnastics and having to share or having to communicate in a different way in all these different languages. What are you finding with Mandarin that is maybe putting you through another round of, like, okay, I got to think about this differently, or this is how I would say it in Russian, but I can't say that way in Mandarin, or anything like that? Are you encountering any thought processes like that?
Mm. Well, thought processes at this point, no. I'm kind of wondering about how it's going to be once I start writing and reading.
Mm.
That seems like a whole other ball game. But right now, no, just because Pimsleur, I mean, it's very clear about shadowing exactly what the native speaker says and exactly what it means. Of course, it's not going to be like the same thing. I mean, even one super simple example is saying delicious while you say really good to eat instead. So those kinds of things. Word order is a little bit different, and Pimsleur doesn't really explain grammar, so I'm like, all right, I'll just do it this another time, and see why. But right now I'm just going with the flow. So in terms of thought processes, I'm not encountering anything so far. I think I will, but not right now.
I really applaud you for having different languages that are not connected to one another, because, and like I have two languages that are connected to one another and I can't keep them straight from Wednesday to Friday. So I think it's really terrific that that you're able to do that. And I'd like to hear that you have so much consciousness around learning Chinese and Mandarin Chinese and taking it at your pace and doing what feels right for you. And I think that's so important because I think people like us who love the sound of different languages and love speaking to people who speak different languages, we're eager to say, okay, I want to learn that. That sounds really good. Or I like the way that feels when I'm saying certain words. But I don't always think that we think about the emotions that come with it. I don't often think we think about the usability of the language that we'll have in our lives and how it will really impact us. So I think that you doing it with this great level, this high level of consciousness is really important. I think it's really important. And it's important for your self-preservation where you are now. And maybe you're not protecting yourself as much as you were when you were younger, but you're blossoming in a way that feels organic and safe for you to do so. And I think that's so healthy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elle. I mean, I admire your work so, so much. You ask like the best questions too,
Oh my gosh.
with all these amazing people on your podcast. So just hearing all of that from you, it warms my heart. Thank you so much.
I just think, well, thank you for saying that. I think it's very, very important that, we honor our differences, we honor where we are, and we honor how we relate to one another. I try to do that with this show. I don't want to sit here and say, well, how do you say this in Mandarin? How do you say that? And, you say this in Russian. Well, how do you say that in Mandarin? Because that's inauthentic. And I don't believe in that kind of stuff because I'm not here to make clickbait. I'm here to get to learn and get to know about somebody and hear their story, and hold space for somebody's story, because I think that we don't do that often enough in society, and we don't do that often enough as a language learning community. So hopefully other people get what I'm trying to do here. You talk a lot about mental health, and you've mentioned mental health. You've mentioned mental health so far in this conversation, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that. Um, what do you think we could do better as far as preserving our mental health as language learners? How can we all be as conscious as you are when we're approaching our languages?
I appreciate you saying that about me too. While it may be true in
Yeah.
languages, I'm still working on applying it to other parts of life. It's definitely not so easy. I get it so much. And it's what sent me down into the depths of, so much suffering when I was and this was like totally apart from Mandarin. This was really centered around, okay, I've got to learn as many languages as possible. Um, I've got to branch out into as many different languages as possible. So the language community knows that I'm worthy to be one of them.
Mhm, mhm.
I've got to learn this fast. Like if I learn this in less than a year, if I learn, Turkish in less than a year, then I'm a complete failure. And spoiler alert, I didn't learn it in a year. I'm still learning it. And I had to really sit with those emotions there.
Right.
Um, and so, of course, there are different mental health issues. I think we've identified a lot of those in terms of identity and how we feel to those languages. And I also think in terms of, as you said, clickbait, like what we see online, we get inundated with so much information all the time, and it's not going to slow down ever, with where we're going. Um, there's always a need for more and just instant gratification. And it never asks us or prompts us to slow down, as you said before. Like we just don't see this more slowing down of talking about identity and really processing what these languages mean to us and what they can mean to other people and other cultures in that way. Um, we're so I talk we, not I mean not everyone is, but a very large percentage of what I've seen in the language learning circles that I've run with for, I mean, almost a decade so metrics focused and flexing like all over the place. I mean, first of all, I really advise people just take a step back, and if you even see anything like that, you go in to that video or that interview, right? Interview on the streets or whatever, and you come out less inspired and more down on yourself than when you came in. That's a really good indication that you're like, all right, like, why did this happen for me? There's a reason behind it. Why do I like that kind of stuff? It's okay to like things, but again, two things can be right at the same time, right? And so we really it's so helpful for us to see underneath again another layer of what could be going on for us. Of course, that's going to look different for everyone, but ultimately just knowing how to set your own boundaries, and that comes with a lot of goodness once you really build that within yourself and show yourself that kind of commitment, though I know it's so hard to do. Um, but know the boundaries and know what values you want to live by for your life. That has really helped me personally know what is not healthy for me. Personally, I cannot watch any of those, polyglot speaks whatever languages, like 20 languages.
I was
Even,
just gonna say that.
yeah.
Yep.
Yes. And you know what? I made that exact video and I made a video this year being like, all right, well, that was a very inauthentic video because I was being someone that I was clearly not. And there needs to be more talk about this, like this aspect of mental health in the language communities that I see,
Hmm.
because it can be inspiring, but when you're constantly bombarded by that, like once the algorithm starts feeding you all of that after you watch one, it's like, okay, like
Hmm.
I don't know if I'm good enough. So really knowing how to set those boundaries for yourself, knowing how to think critically about what you're really seeing, because there's so much that you're not seeing.
What you were saying about viewing this kind of content and how it can really be damaging toward, uh, maybe it could be seen as aspirational, inspirational, for certain people, but I agree with you. I think that it does damage, it can damage a person's self-worth of feeling like, well, you know, I've been studying Korean for 15 years and I still can't go down to order Korean food for myself, or I can't go and buy Korean beauty products for myself because I'm anxious to talk to people, or I'm nervous, or I don't want to be judged. And I think it's it's not very authentic. And it, like, I agree with you. It's damaging. It's damaging. It's clickbait. It makes us want quick results. It makes us want to just
Mhm.
see the the fruits of our labor so quickly when maybe we haven't earned them yet. And anything in between. I never really thought about it, how in the entirety of the internet space, mental health is so important. But in language learning, yeah, it's really a wonderful thing that you're focusing on and helping people to manage and helping people to navigate.
I mean, especially when I was affected by it, again, I didn't see anyone really talking about it. I don't want to mispronounce her last name because I know I've been mispronouncing it in like a lot of my YouTube videos, but
Mm,
Lindy, yes, she talked a little bit about it, and I would just eat up like all of that content because I was like, oh my gosh, there's someone talking about it, like being jealous of this person or not feeling good enough. Even on the outside, it looks, impressive and whatnot. And I know we're all human. We all have that part of ourselves. We've all felt that way, and it's again, like you said, it's so frustrating to see some of this especially on YouTube, I think, especially because people as creators, like they have to make their money and they know what kind of verbiage language learners are going to latch on to, maybe to their own detriment, right? It's always constantly seeing like learn the lazy way or learn without studying or, that along that kind of thing, fluent in 1 month, everything like that. And when language learning does inevitably get hard for all of us, because it will at some point, then we can tend to beat ourselves up a lot more about that. And so it's, and again, it's not going to slow down. Like, it's so hard to sift through all of the noise in order to really focus on your mental health. It
yeah,
really is. It really
yeah.
is. Because I think what a lot of us can fall into the trap of is really just bending over backwards in order to like bow to language's will. Like, I'm not sure how to better phrase it, but
Mhm.
doing that instead of, okay, prioritizing yourself first because you really cannot do all of it. No one can. Like, how are languages going to fit around you instead of the other way around?
Right. How, for you, how has being able to connect to Mandarin, how has it changed you? How has it affected you in the language community? How has it affected you outside of the language community?
Yeah, good question. I think within the language community, um, now I feel I can relate to people more, especially if they're learning Chinese. And it's just nice to be
Mhm.
able to relate to someone else who's learning the same language or a similar language in the same family. So that feels nice. There's a little bit more of belonging there, which feels nice um, to feel that. And then I would say, and I noticed it, when I was in even just driving around, of course, I always had my Pimsleur app open and I always forgot my earbuds. So I would be listening to them, like shadowing Mandarin for me, and I would be repeating it. But I always noticed that, in person, I am definitely not comfortable, I mean, talking really at all. Um, and I noticed, I would always turn the volume down when I was maybe like walking to a restaurant or something, and there would be someone passing by, and I was like, "Oh, they're going to hear that I'm learning Mandarin." And then I feel, there's a lot of an feeling like an imposter in that way. Or if I see someone else, I love any sort of Asian food. So anytime we would eat at like a Japanese or Korean Chinese restaurant, sometimes there would be someone speaking Mandarin there, like I could hear them, and sometimes there would be other people who were not Asian, and they would be conversing with them. And I just noticed, I didn't obviously I didn't say anything about it, but I just noticed internally, wow, I still feel like an imposter,
Mm,
and I'm not sure what to do about that. And that's okay that I don't know right now. Um, as I get, a little bit more exposure to it, and again, giving myself time to reflect about how I want to move around with this language. Maybe after all, I figure that I won't want to speak it with anyone except with other adoptees who are learning the language because there are 10 of them. Then maybe that's what I'll do. But yeah, I mean, just being open to that possibility and knowing that that is gonna crop up again, the
mhm.
whole feeling imposter and stuff. So it
Yeah.
definitely has affected like how I perceive that other people still perceive me.
Hmm. That's interesting. And these are observations that, you're at the very start of this process. And like you
Mhm.
said, as you move further along, of course, your feelings are going to change and your attitudes are going to change. And I guess your demands of the language too can also change. I think it's a really wonderful place to be in at the beginning, and especially with the um, ability to reflect that you have, and the way that you got it all together. From where I sit, you have it all together. So being able to have that all together in the beginning, I think, is so powerful, because down the road at some point you may forget this feeling. You may forget, because they're the little things, and you don't always remember the little things, but it's very precious to remember at this stage of where you are, because at some point you're going to look back and reflect, or you're going to look back and see how far you've come, and it's all part of your story, and it's all going to make you richer for it, in the end. I'd love to hear what you're working on now, and I'd love to hear more about your channel and your social platforms, but most importantly, please let us know where we can find you.
Of course, yes. So I would say I'm most active on my YouTube channel, Language Travel Adoptee, and that'll probably be the same like all through this year in 2024. But I am also on Instagram just under Language Travel Adoptee as well. And I do have my own podcast. I'm planning to launch season 2 this year. Still waiting because there's a lot of projects going on. But I do have season 1 out already. It's called the Language, Wellness, and Identity Podcast. And on the side, I am building out my group coaching program to really walk other language learners who are interested in learning their languages mindfully, um, and really determining for themselves their own boundaries, how they can have languages work for them instead of always like working for languages, right? Really building out that group coaching program to really launch it more this year. So there's a lot going on, but usually the best way to keep up with me is through YouTube.
Through YouTube. Amazing.
Mhm.
I'll add links to all of those to the show notes for this episode so that people who want to follow you or get in touch can just click and do so right away.
Yes, thank you so much, Elle. This was so much fun.
Thank you. I really enjoyed learning more about what you do and learning about what's behind what you do and what drives what you do. And I wish you so much success in the future and going forward.
Thank you.
I like to end each episode with the same question. Do you have any jokes, popular sayings, tongue twisters, cool slang words, idioms, words of wisdom, or words of advice in Mandarin to share and to teach us? And if you'd like to open it up to any of the languages that you speak and you would feel more comfortable sharing and speaking in another language, that's up to you, whatever you
Yeah.
choose.
Of course. Yeah, so well, I'm going to share my most advanced word that I know in Chinese right now. Um, I think I this was probably when I was just watching like a random YouTube video, probably one of those street interviews because I was just curious about how Pimsleur would, or I guess what I learned from that program would translate into something that I would just hear regular people saying. Um, and there was a word that I really, really liked. I think I, I'm going to try to pronounce it. Yuan Fen. And if anyone is out there like thinking about, oh, I'm not sure if I said that right, what I want to say is I think it's like a word for fate, sort of, but I
Hmm.
had to look it up after I heard that street interview, because I really liked that. And I tend to, in different languages, really be attracted to words about like wanderlust or like a yearning or that's something like destiny sort of.
Hmm.
So I think that's why I really like this word a lot, but it really describes really between like two people, I guess. Probably in English, maybe the closest thing would be serendipity. Kind of like,
Oh.
yeah, it's like specifically talking about people, from what I understand, but they're brought together by like this mysterious force, like it was fate, and it's meaningful for them.
Ooh.
So, yeah.
Yuan Fen.
Hmm.
Okay. Hopefully, if somebody wants to correct or add anything to that, they can do so respectfully in the comments or DMs. I do
Yeah.
not want people kicking off. But no, I love words like that too, because I think we don't really have a robust like vocabulary bank for words like that describe like yearning. Even the word yearning, I feel like you don't hear as often as maybe we
Mm-hmm.
feel a yearning. And I think that it's very poetic in other languages. So thank you for sharing that one.
Of course, yes.
Well, thank you so much again. Before I let you go, I want to ask you, and you have quite a list to choose from, but in this situation, after you've been talking to someone for quite some time, you're enjoying the conversation, you're learning from one another, you make someone think about something very profoundly, but you're about to go your separate ways. In the first language that comes to mind, what is the best way to say goodbye?
Oh, that's a really good one. I've been dabbling in Korean, and that is what I did most recently. So really, I have no idea what the literal translation is, but I know it's um 안녕히 계세요.
안녕,
That one.
안녕 기세요. I know that word.
안녕히 계세요.
So 안녕, 안녕 기세요. Emily, thank you so
Yes,
much again for this conversation, and I'll be talking to you soon.
of course. Thank you so much, Elle, for having me.
Bye.
Bye.
Special shout out to Speaking Tongues supporters and listeners Heidi L., Pat N., and John L. New episodes of Speaking Tongues are available every Monday, 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and to like and share episodes with other language lovers like ourselves. Ciao!